The hegemony of Skaleth had built their empire on a simple principle: the strong devour the weak, and everything else is just philosophical masturbation for species too pathetic to admit it. For 3 centuries, this charming worldview had served them remarkably well, transforming them from a collection of feuding tribal clans into the undisputed masters of 3 entire sectors. Their recipe for success was elegantly straightforward: find someone weaker, crush them thoroughly, take their stuff, and repeat until the galaxy ran out of convenient victims. The Skaleth themselves were evolutionary masterpieces of intimidation, standing 9 feet tall with chitinous exoskeletons that could deflect small arms fire and mandibles capable of crushing steel. Their homeworld of HFY was a delightful paradise of constant warfare, toxic storms, and predators that made Earth's extinct dinosaurs look like cuddly house pets. Natural selection had been particularly enthusiastic there, producing a species that viewed diplomacy as something other races did while they sharpened their weapons. Which made the current situation at Kepler 7 diplomatic station particularly amusing, at least from a cosmic irony standpoint. Here they were, these apex predators of the galaxy, sitting across a negotiating table from what they considered the galactic equivalent of a house cat: humans. Humanity had earned quite the reputation in their brief 70-year membership in galactic civilization. They were the diplomats, the mediators, the ones who showed up with briefcases full of carefully worded treaties when everyone else was reaching for plasma rifles. While the Skaleth conquered through fear, and the crystalline Helix Confederation bought their way to power, humans had somehow talked their way into controlling key trade routes and strategic positions. It was almost insulting how effective they were at avoiding actual conflict. The current crisis had emerged, as these things often do, from a perfectly reasonable territorial dispute. The Skaleth wanted exclusive access to the Meridian Corridor, a hyperspace route that connected their territory to some lovely resource-rich systems they'd been eyeing for annexation. The humans, in their typically unreasonable fashion, suggested that maybe everyone could share the space lanes like civilized beings. The Skaleth response had been equally typical: agree to our terms or we'll take the corridor by force and throw in a few human colonies as a bonus. Ambassador Mira Castellanos sat at the negotiating table with a kind of relaxed posture that suggested she was either supremely confident or suffering from a complete disconnect with reality. At 34, she was young for a senior diplomat, with a sort of understated appearance that allowed her to blend into crowds. Average height, dark hair pulled back in a practical bun, and eyes that seemed perpetually amused by some private joke. Her personnel file, had anyone bothered to read it thoroughly, might have raised some interesting questions about her background in military intelligence, but the Skaleth had never been big on research. Across from her lounged Warlord Vexthak the Bloodrender, Supreme Commander of the Skaleth 3rd Battle Fleet and owner of the galaxy's most extensive collection of enemy skulls. His son, Kozak, sat beside him with the sort of barely contained aggression that suggested he'd rather be somewhere else, preferably somewhere involving explosions and screaming. The human speaks many words, Kozak observed in heavily accented galactic standard, his mandibles clicking with amusement. But words are wind. The Meridian Corridor will be ours within the cycle, whether through your permission or over your corpses. Mira nodded thoughtfully, as if seriously considering this diplomatic insight. That's certainly one approach. Though historically speaking, species that rely exclusively on threats tend to encounter what we call unexpected complications. The reptilian Ambassador Quillith, representing the Nashin Mediation Service, shifted nervously between them. His species had evolved from prey animals, which made them excellent at reading danger signals, a skill that was currently screaming warnings about the tension in the room. Perhaps we could explore alternative arrangements, Quillith suggested hopefully. Shared access schedules, taxation agreements. There will be no sharing, Vexthak rumbled, his voice like grinding stone. The strong take what they will. The weak endure what they must. This is the way of the galaxy. Absolutely, Mira agreed cheerfully. Though I've always found it interesting how perspectives on strength and weakness can shift so dramatically. Sometimes what looks like strength is just loud noise, and what appears to be weakness is actually restraint. Kozak's head snapped toward her, mandibles spreading in what might have been a grin on a creature that understood joy rather than just violence. Restraint? Is that what humans call cowardice now? We call it professionalism, Mira replied evenly. though I understand the distinction might be subtle for some species. The silence that followed was the sort that diplomatic protocol manuals specifically warn about, the kind that precedes either breakthrough agreements or interstellar wars. Captain Elena Voss, standing at attention near the human delegation, kept her hand casually near her sidearm while maintaining the expression of someone thinking about grocery lists. Kozak rose from his chair, his full 9-foot height casting a shadow across the table. Perhaps the human diplomat requires a demonstration of Skaleth strength. Your people hide behind words and treaties like insects behind rocks. Actually, Mira said, pulling up a holographic display, I was hoping we could discuss the economic benefits of cooperation. Based on our analysis, shared access to the Meridian Corridor would increase trade efficiency by 37%, which translates to enough. Kozak slammed a clawed fist onto the table, cracking the reinforced polymer surface. You speak of profit while warriors discuss honor. This is why your species will never understand true power. Mira looked up from her datapad with the expression of a teacher whose student had just asked whether 2 + 2 equaled elephant. I see we're approaching this from different philosophical frameworks. Would you prefer to discuss this privately? Sometimes these conversations go more smoothly without an audience. What followed was either cosmic comedy or inevitable tragedy, depending on one's perspective on the universe's sense of humor. Kozak interpreted Mira's suggestion as an admission of weakness, a desperate attempt to negotiate from a position of fear away from public scrutiny. In the private conference room, he decided to make his position absolutely clear. Your pathetic species clings to diplomacy because you lack the spine for real conflict, he snarled, backing Mira against the viewport that offered a spectacular view of the nebula surrounding Kepler-7. When the Meridian Corridor is ours, we will remember this insult. Perhaps a few human colonies will burn to teach your people proper respect. Mira studied him with the clinical interest of a xenobiologist observing an aggressive specimen. That would be inadvisable. Threats. Kozak laughed, the sound like breaking glass. From a species that has never won a real war? Your people are merchants and bureaucrats. When violence comes, you fold like cheap fabric. Actually, our military record is quite extensive. We just prefer not to advertise it. Mira's voice carried the same conversational tone she might use to discuss weather patterns. But please, continue with your current approach. I'm sure it will work out exactly as you expect. The warning might as well have been delivered in a dead language. Kozak saw only confirmation of human weakness, fear disguised as confidence. Within 6 hours of returning to his flagship, he'd ordered the attack on human convoy Delta-7, a collection of merchant vessels carrying humanitarian supplies to the outer rim settlements. It would be a perfect demonstration, swift, brutal, and guaranteed to bring the humans crawling to the negotiating table with new appreciation for Skaleth power. The convoy's destruction went exactly as planned. 12 ships, 300 civilian crew members, medical supplies destined for colonists dealing with a plague outbreak, all of it reduced to expanding debris fields in less than 20 minutes. Kozak transmitted the attack footage directly to Kepler-7, along with a simple message: this is the price of defiance. Surrender the corridor, or more convoys will follow. Back at the diplomatic station, the various alien delegations watched the footage with a sort of horrified fascination usually reserved for natural disasters. Ambassador Quilleth actually turned an interesting shade of green, while several other species representatives began quietly updating their governments on the situation. Everyone waited for the human response, pleas for mercy, desperate attempts at negotiation, perhaps an offer to surrender the corridor in exchange for peace. Instead, Mira Castellanos sat in the conference room, reviewing the attack footage with a sort of professional interest that suggested she was taking notes. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the same pleasant tone she'd maintained throughout the negotiations. Captain Voss, please transmit our response to Fleet Command. Already done, Voss replied, consulting her tactical display. Strike Package Alpha is moving into position. Admiral Chen estimates 18 minutes to engagement. The other delegates stared at this exchange with growing confusion. Where were the tears, the desperate appeals, the frantic attempts at damage control? Quilleth cleared his throat nervously. Ambassador Castellanos, surely there's still room for negotiation. Perhaps if we contacted Warlord Vexthak directly. Mira looked up with genuine surprise. Oh, we're well past negotiation now. Kozak made his position quite clear, and we're responding in kind. It's actually rather refreshing. No more diplomatic double talk, just honest communication through practical demonstration. The reality of human military doctrine began to manifest in the Kethvar system approximately 37 minutes later. The Skaleth had always assumed that humanity's focus on diplomacy indicated military weakness, a reasonable conclusion given their preference for talking over fighting. This assumption proved to be what military historians would later classify as a catastrophic intelligence failure. The human response wasn't the slow, lumbering assault the Skaleth expected from a merchant species. Instead, it was a surgical dissection performed by specialists who'd been planning for this exact scenario since first contact. Stealth ships that had been positioned throughout Skaleth space for years suddenly activated, their presence having been dismissed as sensor ghosts or navigational errors. Advanced AI systems took control of Skaleth communications networks, turning their own coordination systems against them. Kinetic bombardment platforms, hidden in asteroid belts and thought to be mining operations, began delivering tungsten rods at significant fractions of light speed. Kozak's flagship, the Bone Crusher, found itself facing enemies that refused to behave according to accepted military doctrine. Instead of massive battle formations and dramatic ship-to-ship combat, they encountered precision strikes that targeted specific systems with surgical accuracy. His weapons went offline first, followed by engines, then life support systems. His crew, trained for glorious battle against worthy enemies, discovered themselves dealing with technical failures and system cascades that left them helpless. The communication that finally reached Kepler-7 came not from Kozak, but from his surviving communications officer. The young Skaleth's mandibles trembled as she transmitted their unconditional surrender, along with coordinates for retrieving what remained of their fleet. Interesting, Mira observed, reviewing the tactical reports. It seems Kozak's demonstration of Skaleth strength was somewhat less impressive than advertised. Warlord Vexthak arrived at the station 18 hours later, his transport the only vessel in his son's fleet still capable of faster-than-light travel. The supreme commander of the Third Battle Fleet looked like he'd aged several decades during the journey, his chitinous shell bearing stress fractures that spoke of profound psychological trauma. "My son," he said simply, settling heavily into his chair. "What have you done with my son?" "Kozak is alive," Mira assured him, consulting her datapad. "Currently in medical custody aboard the CNS Wellington, receiving treatment for decompression injuries and what our doctors describe as acute psychological adjustment disorder. He'll make a full recovery, assuming he responds well to therapy." "Therapy? Well, we can't very well return him to active military service in his current condition. He seems to be suffering from some fundamental misconceptions about cause and effect relationships. Our xenopsychologists are confident they can help him develop a more realistic worldview." The implications of human therapy for a Skaleth warrior hung in the air like toxic gas. Vexthak had built his reputation on the principle that defeat in battle meant death or slavery, honorable outcomes that allowed for proper narratives. The idea that his son might be psychologically adjusted by the enemy was somehow more disturbing than simple execution. "What are your terms?" he asked finally. Mira smiled, and for the first time since the negotiations began, it reached her eyes. "Actually, we'd like to revisit our original proposal about shared access to the Meridian Corridor, with a few minor modifications, of course." The treaty that emerged from the subsequent negotiations was remarkable for several reasons, not least of which was how thoroughly it exceeded humanity's original objectives. The Skaleth not only agreed to shared access, but also accepted human oversight of corridor traffic, established joint patrol protocols, and committed to substantial reparations for the destroyed convoy. They also agreed to participate in what the document diplomatically termed cultural exchange programs, which would allow human military advisors to provide training in advanced strategic thinking. Ambassador Quillith, reviewing the final documents, couldn't quite hide his amazement. "Remarkable. In 40 years of diplomatic service, I've never seen such a dramatic shift in negotiating positions. It's all about finding the right communication method," Mira explained, signing the treaty with a flourish. "Some species respond to economic incentives, others to legal frameworks. The Skaleth apparently needed a more direct approach to fully appreciate the nuances of interstellar cooperation. As the various delegations prepared to depart Kepler-7, word of the negotiations spread throughout the galaxy with a speed that interesting news always achieves. The story that emerged was one that would be told in diplomatic schools and military academies for generations. How the weak human diplomat had allowed her opponent to define the terms of engagement, then responded with such decisive force that the entire balance of power had shifted. The hegemony of Skaleth, built on the principle that strength conquers all, discovered that their definition of strength had been somewhat limited. They'd confused noise for power, intimidation for capability, and assumptions for intelligence. The humans, those soft diplomats who preferred negotiation to conflict, had simply been choosing their battles rather than avoiding them. Kozak eventually returned to Skaleth space after 6 months of human therapy, though he was never quite the same. He developed an almost obsessive interest in human military history and strategic doctrine, often quoting Sun Tzu and Clausewitz in conversations with fellow warriors who found his new philosophical bent deeply unsettling. His father occasionally wondered if death in battle might have been preferable to having a son who'd been convinced that true strength came from knowing when not to fight. The galaxy's political landscape shifted accordingly. Species that had dismissed humans as overly peaceful merchants began reviewing their intelligence assessments and military doctrine. The phrase diplomatic solution acquired new connotations, carrying implications that made even warrior races pause before rejecting negotiated settlements. And in the quiet corridors of the Terran Diplomatic Corps, a new generation of ambassadors studied the Meridian Corridor incident as a masterclass in strategic patience. They learned that sometimes the most effective response to might makes right was to demonstrate that definitions of might could vary considerably, and that the species known for talking their way out of fights were equally capable of talking their way into them. The universe, as it turned out, had quite the sense of humor about strength and weakness. The Skaleth had called the human diplomat weak, expecting easy capitulation and profitable conquest. Instead, they'd encountered something far more dangerous than simple strength. They'd met competence, wrapped in politeness, and backed by the sort of military capability that preferred to remain theoretical. Kozak had paid the price in blood, though not quite in the way he'd anticipated. Sometimes the most expensive lessons were the ones that left you alive to remember them. The galaxy took note, and diplomacy was never quite the same again.